Welcome to the video where we're going to walk you through how to use something known as summary queries. Summary queries are queries that will allow us to group data together and do calculations on it. And this first set of queries that the book talks about in chapter 5 is really just walking you through aggregate functions. And if you've ever used Excel, you've probably used a function like the count function or the sum function or the average function or min and max. And fortunately, because Excel and SQL are kind of distant cousins of each other in some ways, you really can kind of get your head around this idea of doing a sum or a count. Now this first query, before I run it, I'm going to start to kind of clean up the code just because I like to have clean code. I like to be able to see it spaced out nicely and know what I'm doing. And I'm actually just going to run a select star from this just so that we can see what the table, like kind of the base set of the data that's in this query is returning. So I select star from invoices where the invoice total minus payment minus credit is greater than 0. So that's this total minus payment and credit, and if that results in something greater than 0, it returns it. So if I go through here and look at this, I'm returning about 40 rows that we owe money on in this invoice table. And so what we can do is we can take counts of this, we can take sums of this, we could take averages. And so let's just, for the heck of it, let's just do something really quickly. I'm going to copy this data and I'm going to export it in the format of CSV with headers, and I'm going to put it on my clipboard. So bear with me for a second, because what I want to do is I'm going to actually take this data and we're going to move over here to Excel and I'm going to paste it in here. And now that I've got the data here, I want to just take a look at this and see how many, columns I have. So I have, let's see, a count of 40 rows. If I take this invoice total and I select all of it, I can just do a quick feature down here, 68,196 and 24 cents. So we're used to doing this, thing like where we can take a count and I can count this and it will tell me, the number of rows. I can also do something like a sum function and I can go and sum this amount here. And you'll see I get 68,196. So let's actually go back and see how to do that within SQL. So what we're going to do is we're going to remove this star. And first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to go ahead and select the count of all the rows. Now, let's just run this, and what that's doing is saying count of all the rows, and you'll see that we got 40, just like we got over here. Now, select counting star versus let's say counting the specific values in a column may not really provide any different results. What this is simply doing is saying, hey, I want a count of all the values in this column. Now, if there aren't values in that column, if there's null values, then you might find that you get a different number. So if I'm taking account of the primary key, we know there's always going to be values, so therefore I know I'll get an accurate count. But if you want a count of all the rows, just do a count star, and again, that will tell me, okay, I have 40 rows. So now let's add a comma back in here. Let's run the original query, and let's do a sum of, and actually I'm going to update this really quickly. I'm going to just do a sum of invoice total. And we're going to get a value back, and it's going to be 68,196.24, which is exactly what we got back over here. So I just want to kind of point that out because if you're used to doing this in Excel, doing some functions in Excel, then it's not going to seem too foreign to you here. So what we've simply done here is taken account of all the rows, and we've given it the column alias number of invoices. We've also taken a sum of this expression. So this is going to take the sum of invoice total minus the sum of payment total minus the sum of the credit total, and what we have left over is 66,796. We get checked on Excel, but I know it's right. So I'm going to move to the next example, which is going to walk through some additional types of functions. So this first thing we have here is just a literal string, so it's just returning this value after 1124, and it's saying that because they're adding in this where clause that's taking any invoices after the January 1st, 2014 date. And so now what it's then doing next is saying, give me a count of all the rows in invoices, which in this case, there are 114 invoices after January 1st, 2014. It's taking an average of the total, and that average is $18.79.74, and it's also rounding it off. If I took this rounding off here and I just ran it, sorry, can't do that. Let's just say I took this off and I ran it like so. It's going to give me this crazy number. So what we can do is go in here and just simply add in a round of this value, add comma to the second decimal, and then this is a sum of the invoice total. And just so we are aware, I'll just do one quick thing, just so that, you know, just to kind of give you confidence in how this works. I'm going to grab this again, and I'm going to export all of this data, and I'm going to paste it right here. Actually, let's make sure we're going to be able to paste it right over this. All right. So what we're doing here is we've captured, let's see, 114 rows, which is what the query told us it was doing. It's going to take, let's look at the average amount. Let's see here. All right. So the average invoice total amount is $18.7974. That's what we got here. Let's look at the total invoice amount. So let's just sum that up, and that sum here is 2014 290.51, 2014 290.51. Sorry. So again, once you kind of get your head around the data structure, you can start to add these functions in here to do calculations. So if you look at this next one, if you kind of can think about what it's going to do, you know, you can see that it's going to take the literal string, it's going to take the count of all the rows, it's going to give us the max invoice, and it's going to give us the lowest invoice. And if you go check the data, you'll see that there is an invoice total for 6. And the highest invoice total is 37,966.19. So let's also look at this one thing, which is honestly a little confusing, but what if you wanted to take the, a vendor or a string value, essentially, and grab the very first value in that column? Well, so what you could do is you could just say, I want to select, the information here where the row number is, if I'm grabbing the very first vendor name, I could sort by vendor name and grab where the row number is, equal to, or let's say less than 2, which would grab one row. But in this case, we don't want to only just grab one row. We actually want to grab the count of vendors. And so you can actually use min and max, which typically would be for, numeric values. You can actually use it for string values too. So min will give you the, closest to the A side of the string value. Max is going to actually give you the closest to the Z side of the string value. And that's what it's doing here. And the last thing it was going to point out here is using distinct. So if I go in here and let's just make this even simpler. Let's just remove this information here and let's just run this. If I run it like this, you'll see that it's giving me 2 counts. One is the distinct count of vendors, and the other is the count of vendor IDs. So what this is doing is, when we're looking at the invoice table, we know that every invoice has to have a vendor ID. So the count, it ends up matching the number of invoices, which is 114. But we know that vendors can have many invoices, and a vendor doesn't necessarily have to have an invoice. And so if you do a count distinct of the vendor ID, in fact, if we wanted to, we could go in here and just do a, let's do a distinct vendor ID. If we do this, we're going to get 34 distinct values. And that is because only 34 vendors have actually sent us invoices. So if I do a count of the distinct vendor ID, it'll actually roll that up and give me the actual count. It's pretty cool. All right. So let's talk about how we group data and summarize it. Now, what we're going to do is, in the book, we're going to introduce a couple of new clauses here. At this point, we've been talking about select, from, where, and order by. But now what we're going to start to do is we're going to add in this new thing where we're going to group by data. So this is where we want to, let's say, take a count of some information like an arithmetic amount, like a total or something, and we want to but we want to group that and break it up by let's say a field like a vendor ID or a state or a city, and we'll use an example here. The other one we're going to talk about is having, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a second, but just know that now we have kind of introduced a little bit more to the SQL statement. We're still going to always wrap up by order by, because remember, the first thing that happens here is the from clause will go and pull the data. The next thing that happens is the data is filtered through the where clause. At that point, it will then be grouped if it is being grouped, and it will then be using having is actually where we're going to filter based on these grouped values, and I'll show you what that means here in a second. The last thing we do is, or the second to last thing we do is the select statement, which basically picks out the columns and renames them if we want to with column aliases. And then the very, very last thing that runs is the order by, right? That's just the sorting of the values. So now we have this new syntax. And so let's go in and talk a little bit about what that's going to look like. All right, so let's say that we want to do a count of invoices. So what we're going to do is we're going to, let's just start with something like this. We're going to do a count of invoices. Now, we know there's 114 invoices, but let's say that we want to know by vendor how many invoices they've sent us. So to do that, we have to add in a couple of different things. So one is we're going to add in, say, I want to select the vendor and I will select the count of the invoices, or select the count of rows associated with that vendor. Now, here's the thing. If I run it just like this, it's going to give me this error, and that's because it's going to say you're not there's not a single group function. And again, these aren't the best error messages, but if you look at it, it says line 61, column 9. Let's see where that actually takes us. So it actually takes me right here, and it says, hey, this value that you put in here, it needs to be grouped. And so what that means is we need to group by vendor ID, and so that when we run it, if there is a vendor that has more than one row, it will group that value. So let's actually look at what this data looks like in the table for a second, and let's just let's just grab everything out. And what we'll do is we're going to run it, and I'm going to copy all this data. We're going to export it out into CSV format to my clipboard, and let's do something here. Let's go and let's delete everything here, and let's paste this in. Now, what you'll see here is that, for example, I have one vendor here, 34, that has, let's freeze this here so you can see it. All right, so I have one vendor that actually has 2 invoices. So if I select the count of rows by vendor, what we're going to end up doing here is let's keep it really simple, and let's just get rid of all this other data. Let's just hide this for a second. And what this ends up doing is saying, okay, give me the count of rows, which is, or first it'll say, give me the vendor ID. And then it'll say, give me the count of rows. So we know there's 1, 2 rows. So the problem is we don't want it to return something that looks like this, right? We don't want it to say that vendor ID 34 has 2 and vendor ID 34 has 2. What we actually have to do is we have to group this data or this query by the vendor ID, because we want it to, we have one row. So what we're simply doing is saying group by this amount, and group by this column, And what that will end up doing is rolling the data up. So I'll even give you a simpler example. Or if you've ever used a pivot table, this will probably make a little bit more sense. Let's say that we have this information here, and let's back up and let's see what would it look like in a pivot table. So if I insert a pivot table here, if you don't know what a pivot table is, definitely check it out because it's the pretty coolest thing. So if I grab all this data, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a count of all the values in this set of data, and you'll see here it's 114. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to group by vendor, because what we're doing is we're rolling this up. If I actually looked at this, this is actually 2 rows associated to this vendor. So when we go back here to this query, what we want to do is we want to select not just the count, we want to select the vendor and the count, but we have to group by vendor. And so when I run this, it's going to give me the same thing that we got way back over here in Excel. So let's test it out. Vendor 95 has 6 invoices. So let's go down and look. Sure enough, they have 6 invoices. Now, the one simple rule behind all this that I just teach everybody, but I just wanted to kind of show you the background of that grouping and why we group by these columns. We always group by the non-aggregate part of the select. So let's say I decide to go in here and add in vendor ID. Let's say we want to do it by vendor state. All right. Now, if I do vendor state, I need to group by vendor state. And what we'll do is we'll get a result. Oh, maybe there's not a column called, oh, there is not a column on vendor state, sorry. Let's do it by invoice date. How about that? We know the invoice date is on the invoice. All right. Let's start with, this is how you experiment, this is how you learn. So let's go in here and let me grab invoice date. All right, it's right there. So we should be able to grab the invoice date and take the count of rows. So let's break this down because then we'll walk through the rest of these queries. So let's start by grabbing what we want. Okay. Let's grab the invoice ID. All right. Now I'm going to sort. I'm going to actually order by invoice date so we can see if there are groupings. Sure enough, there are. So what we're going to do is we're going to do a count of the invoice ID. And it's going to give me that error, and that's because it's going to say, look, hey, if you want to do the count, you're going to have to group by the non-aggregate column. So if I don't have a function around a column, then we need to group by that. So simply just adding in a group by, and this is the way I do it. I just go to grab everything off the select statement that doesn't have an aggregate in it, and then I run it. And there you go, right? So we know that like April 16th had 2 invoices. So I don't know why that didn't run earlier, but what we're trying to do is just get you to understand when you're adding in group bys that you go and grab the non-aggregate column out of the select statement, and that becomes part of your group. So if I go back here and look at this original query that we ran, it's selecting the vendor, the count of the invoice, or the count of the rows, and we're grouping by vendor ID. And that's how we get those results. So let's go through these a little quicker now. Summary query that calculates the invoice total. So it's going to do the average total by invoice ID. Now, there's a little bit of an additional piece in here, and let's talk about what this is. Let's take it out and let's run it and see what happens without it. Okay, we get a lot more results. So what's happening here is that we are selecting the average invoice total from the invoices table. We're also selecting the vendor ID, and we're going to group by vendor ID. So if we run this by itself, what this is doing is it's basically giving me for every vendor ID, it's giving me their average invoice amount. And then it's ordering by the average invoice amount up here, descending. So what this is saying, here's a list of all the vendors and their average amount from starting from highest to lowest. Now let's introduce the having clause really quickly. So the having clause is basically like a where clause, but it's for aggregate columns. So you wouldn't go in here and say where the average invoice total. If I wanted to only get the average invoice totals greater than 2,000, you don't actually add that to the where clause, because the where clause applies to the non-aggregate columns. So it's filtering things before we group. So what we're doing here is that if we want to filter based on the aggregate columns, this is saying, so I'm not filtering based on vendor ID or anything. I'm just filtering based on the aggregate columns. This is going to return things that are above 2,000. Now, if I wanted to, I could also go in here and I could filter where I could say where vendor ID is greater than 100. I could run this and it should return the vendor ID. So this is not an aggregate column. So I could filter out non-aggregate columns in the where, but I can filter out aggregate values in the having. So that's the thing to get your head around, is like when you're filtering on aggregate columns, use it you're going to use having. When you're filtering just based on non-aggregate values or non-aggregate columns, you're going to use the where clause. So that's what we're doing there. This next one, I'm going to start to kind of clean these up a little bit. So we have vendor state, we have vendor city, we have the count, and we have the average total. Now, because we have two non-aggregate columns here, we can't just group by one column because, again, we'll get an error if we do that, because it's going to say, hey, you can't provide these aggregate counts and averages for city and state, but only group by state. We have to group by the city and state. So again, the rule is, if you're sitting here and you're like, all right, I've written this out, what do? I always just go and simply grab the non-aggregate columns and I say group by, and I paste them in like this. And I try not to mess up the spelling. And I run it, and booyah. What we have is the state, and we're sorting by state and city, so that's why it's sorted. So we have the state and the city, we have the count of rows associated to that city state, and we have the average total for that. So now you can start to see the power of SQL. And if you've ever appreciated the power of Excel and doing pivot tables or doing sums and averages and counts in Excel, we can do the same thing here in SQL. It's just the difference is we're not limited to 1 million rows of data. In a database, we can have hundreds of millions, if not billions of rows of data, and we can do this at a much more faster pace because we're running all this on a server. So this next one, it's going to go through and show you, it's going to grab the, again, vendor state. I think it's grabbing the exact same query here as before, but what it's doing is, and let me just clean it up just so that we can have it make it look nice and understand what it's doing. So we're grabbing the same exact thing. The only thing that they've done now is they've added in this having a count of greater than equal to 2. So that means that rows like this one and this one and this one and this one should go away. So we should not see Phoenix or Los Angeles, but we should see Fresno. So let's run it. And booyah, there's Fresno. No cities with a count greater, or only cities with a count greater than 2 or equal to 2. So again, remember, filtering at an aggregate, if you're filtering based on the count or the average, you do that in the having. If you're filtering just based on a city or a state, we can do that in the where clause. And we would just come in here and say where, state or city equals whatever. And you can actually filter on, other, columns that aren't in the select. We could actually go in and filter, because when the from, we're pulling everything. So I could go in here and say where, vendor ID equals 34, and I could run that. And the ambiguously defined column. So let's fix that with being specific. And there it is. It's I know that vendor had 2 invoices. That's IBM, the 34, ID 34. You start to get to know this data pretty well once you've looked at it a long time. So there you go. Now, this one here is going to just show you the difference again, which we've already kind of done, but it's going to take a query. We're going to run the vendor, we're going to get the vendor name, the count, and the average. So here's the vendor name, their count of invoices, and the average of the invoices totals. And it's going to basically give you where the average invoice total is greater than 500. Now, what we're going to do here is take the exact same thing, but what we're saying is the invoice total is greater than 500. So think about what that's going to do. Let's run it. And it's hard to see what changed, but let's go back. Let's look at Zilka Design, for example. There's 7 and it's 946. And now Zilka Design, so it's 8 and 867. So what happened here was this, right? When we ran this, it went and grabbed the count of all their invoices and the average total for all these, and it showed you only the ones that had an average total greater than 500. What this is doing is first, it's actually going to grab the data and it's going to filter out any invoice totals that are not $500 or above. So it's saying, so in the Zilka Design example, there's actually an invoice that they have that's less than 500. So it filtered it out and then it grouped it. So the where clause is going to happen before the grouping. We're going to do from, where, then group by. Whereas in this scenario, we actually grabbed everything, we grouped it, and then we filtered out. So again, if you want to go back and practice this, run this, and you'll see that we have 8 invoices assigned to Zilka Design, and the other example here. Sorry about this. The other example here is that when we add it into the where clause, what that's doing is doing the filtering before we group. So in this scenario, there's probably an invoice total for Zilka Design that's below 500. And actually, if you want to go check that. Actually, you know what? I'm going to let y'all check that because I'm pretty certain that's what happened. And so if you want to explore that, go actually, you can just grab this, pull that, and go in here and look around for what we are trying to find there, which is the Zilka Design, and trying to figure out if there was a invoice that filtered out. But again, what we're trying to show you is that by filtering in the having and where affects whether that filtering happens before it's grouped or after it's grouped. In this scenario, it's just an example where we're going to run a query and it's going to grab by invoice date and group by the invoice date, the count and the sum. But in here, what it's doing is it's actually adding in a row filter in the having clause, which I don't think is a very good practice. I think that this is something where if we're filtering based on non-aggregate columns like the invoice date, we should add that into the where clause. But it's also grabbing anything it's got a count, count greater than 1 and a sum greater than 100. So, so here's the exact same query, but it's running that where clause. It's running that filter at the non-aggregate level. It's running that in the where clause. And I think this is the one that I would recommend y'all do. Just kind of like we don't want to mix up our where clause and our from clause. Keep our filters in the where clause. Same thing here. Don't add our non-aggregate filters to the having because this is a cleaner piece of code than this. This you actually don't, it doesn't jump out to you that, hey, you're going to actually go filter this data out and then go group it and then go filter out these aggregates. Here it's very explicit where the filtering is happening. So we're going to filter out all the invoices between these dates. Then we're going to group by invoice date, and then we're only going to pull the ones that have a count and sum greater than this amount. So it's better to do it this way for the order, just to have order and cleanliness of code.